2 Corinthians 11, verse 1. I wish you would bear with me in a little foolishness. Do bear with me, for I feel a divine jealousy for you, since I betroth you to one husband, to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or if you accept a different gospel from the one you accepted, you put up with it readily enough. Indeed, I consider that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. Indeed, in every way we have made this plain to you in all things. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself, so that you might be exalted, because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. as the truth of Christ is in me. This boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. And what I am doing, I will continue to do, in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission they work on the same terms as we do. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I am speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I am talking like a madman. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? Am I not weak? Who is made to fall? And I am not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, He who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Artaxerxes was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. We have noticed with the Corinthian Christians that boasting is a problem in this church. Not only are they boasting in themselves and in their works, but they are denigrating Paul and the apostles because of their sufferings. In particular, Paul is denigrated for not having flair or style or entertainment value or eloquence. The charge of his critics is specifically quoted back here in verse 10 of chapter 10. Notice here it says, Paul writes, "For they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech of no account." Now, what Paul wants to do here in chapter 11 is teach these Christians what false and true servants of God look like. Since the critics of Paul are trying to claim their value and importance to this church and are discrediting Paul, Paul will spend his time describing true and false disciples so the church can properly evaluate what Paul has done for them and what these critics are doing. Now, the reason Paul desires to go through this important teaching with these Christians is because of how much he loves them. In the first 2 verses here of chapter 11, Paul tells them that he feels a divine jealousy for them. Paul brought them to Christ through the preaching of the gospel, and he cannot bear to watch them turn against him and what he taught them. What these false teachers are telling them is causing the thoughts of these Christians to be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. These teachers are not helping you, he says, but causing you to turn away. He describes what is happening to them as being similar to the serpent deceiving Eve by his cunning. These people are tricking you, he says. They are causing your thoughts to be turned away from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. This is happening, verse 4, because people are coming in and proclaiming another Jesus other than what Paul and his companions have been preaching in Corinth. And they're accepting the message of the false teachers. They're not seeing these people as the false teachers that they are, but instead are accepting them. We get even more of the sense of this problem in verses 5 and 6. These critics are super apostles, mainly because Paul is unskilled in speaking in the eyes of these Christians. Again, we are seeing an emphasis, an extolsion of oratory skill. We want good speakers. I would like for us to think about this criticism for a moment, because I think many churches have the same criticism and would support preachers based heavily on their speaking skills. But there are even bigger problems than this that Paul is now addressing. First, Paul notes a difference between how Paul came to these Corinthians and how these false teachers have come to them. The false teachers were exalting themselves while Paul came to them in humility. In particular, he is speaking about coming to them for free, even though he had the right to ask to be financially supported while preaching the gospel there. Paul did not want to be a burden to this church in any shape, form, or fashion. He cared about the financial well-being of the church, and he did not want to take much from them, unlike these false teachers. This is, I think, an important characteristic. True disciples of Jesus don't try to take as much money from the church as they can. True disciples try to not burden the church at all. We don't look at the finances of the church and then try to get as much of it as we possibly can, which it appears is what these false teachers have done. They are quite happy to burden the church in Corinth, charging them unnecessarily, and then criticizing Paul for preaching for free to them, taking his support from the churches in Macedonia. Paul is showing that the decisions he made was for the good of the church and not for the good of himself. Paul states in verse 11 that you know that I love you. This is what we should see. True followers will do what is in the best interest of the church, not the best interest of themselves. There are many practical applications, I think, that we can make from this that maybe we don't often see in churches today. How many times have you seen an elder or a preacher in a particular congregation and the Christians want that preacher to leave or want that elder to step down, but they cannot do it? The elder digs in his feet and does not step down. The preacher digs in and refuses to leave. I want us to see that Paul describes that the proper response is to always do what is in the best interest of the church. I have seen preachers that just drive churches into the ground to the point that they have to close their doors, and they don't see that it's in the best interest of that church that they leave. I've seen elders be wasteful with money, so the church is spiritually hurt and unable to function properly. Christian leaders are to help the church, not hurt the church. That's exactly what Paul is doing. Paul tells these Christians that he came to them selflessly. This leads Paul to say something that is sometimes hard to believe. People will claim to be followers of Christ, but are not. Now, we accept this when it comes to the world. We are used to people in the world claiming to be Christians, but we know that they are not based on their beliefs or based on their actions. But what's harder is the person who comes through the doors of the church building, claiming to be a Christian. Paul calls these people who are part of the Corinthian church false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ, verse 13. False Christians are always disguised. They are not clear and obvious. In fact, notice particularly verses 14 and 15 here. It is no wonder that this happens because Even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Even Satan makes you think that what you are doing is right and good. Satan does not come to us and tell us that sin is a horrible decision, that we should avoid it. So we should not be surprised if the servants of Satan also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. People are going to pretend that they are godly. They say things that are plausible, sound good, but their end will be disaster. Paul then describes more about what false teachers and false servants of Christ look like. Verse 18, they boast in themselves and what they do. They boast in their achievements. They make much of themselves. They think highly of themselves. Further, verse 20, they enslave you and take advantage of you. They do not give to you, but merely take. They act arrogantly towards you. They insult you. They abuse you. Paul says that you can identify them because they just hurt you and use you. You can identify them because they make a big deal about themselves. They disguise themselves, but you can see them based on the way they talk and act. But now Paul is going to show us what a true follower looks like, and that begins here in verse 21. Paul declares that the Corinthians apparently want a contest of boasting. These false Christians have been boasting about themselves, so he will gladly play the fool's game and start boasting about himself. But notice what his boasting is. First, he is a true Jew. Now, this may indicate that these false ones were also Jewish and claiming some sort of significance by it. Paul says that he has a pedigree, but what does that matter? So notice where Paul's boasting goes. He describes himself as a servant of Christ by all the things he suffered for Christ. Remember that this was the very thing that the Christians in Corinth were critical of Paul for. His sufferings disqualified him as an apostle. So what does Paul do? Paul magnifies those sufferings all the more. Numerous imprisonments, countless beatings, often near death, scourged 5 times, beaten 3 times, stoned once, shipwrecked, drifting at sea, and in dangers from every person and place. He was without physical comforts, hungry, thirsty, no food, no warmth, no place to cover his head. He had quite a low part of his life when he was a fugitive, being lowered through a window in Damascus. The great Pharisee was now a fugitive for Jesus. Paul overthrows the categories of boasting. Paul does not speak of great things that he has done. Paul does not say that, I established more churches, I preached in more lands, I traveled more miles, brought about more baptisms, wrote the most books of Scripture in the New Testament. By the way, Paul did all of those things. But what does he boast about? If I must boast, verse 30, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. Paul's boast is in his weakness because it's not about himself. It's about God. If anyone could boast, would it not be the Apostle Paul? Who else could compete with his resume? Who else could compare with his accomplishments? Yet what does Paul draw attention to? He draws attention to his weaknesses. Paul never put himself forward. Paul never drew attention to himself. Paul did not boast in himself. He did not think highly of himself. He sacrificed and gave it all to Jesus, and that is seen in how he interacted with the Corinthians. The message of the Apostle Paul can be boiled down to this question: is the person feeding me or feeding on me? Paul says that he fed these Christians in his letters and in his teachings when he was there in person. He did what was best for them, loved them, and cared for them. The false apostles and false servants, however, were feeding on the Corinthians. They put themselves forward. They took advantage of the Corinthians financially. They enslaved the Corinthians. They elevated themselves over the Corinthians. They hurt and abused these Corinthians. They were physically combative. And that's the clear difference between who is true and who is false. Is the person helping us or hurting us? Is the preacher feeding us or feeding on us? Are the shepherds feeding us or feeding on us? Are the teachers feeding us or feeding on us? The false are always taking, and the true are always giving. Let us look at our lives and consider which we are. Are we true or false? Are we servants or do we act like kings? Do we give to others or take from others? Be a servant of Jesus and be a true servant. Do not disguise yourself as a true Christian when you are false, because God knows, and your end will correspond to your deeds. Next time, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I look forward to talking about Paul's visions and the thorn in his flesh. Thanks so much. Have a great and wonderful day.